at one of the most basic levels, we can even observe how we're not free from our own automatic thinking or from our inner impetuses, impulses. Sometimes people will be sitting for tea and the mind will be going, oh God, this is boring. Or, I gotta get up and do something. Or, why hasn't this guy started talking yet? Or, whatever it might be. We have these automatic mechanisms internally that we don't really command. We often don't have sovereignty or control over the things that are going on at an unconscious level. Impulses, drives, desires, cravings, aversions to things. And so often we're at the whim of whatever automatic functioning is just going on. And as I often say to people, if you have a lake, and we'll say the lake is like the mind, the way to calm it is not to try to bat down every wave. A lot of people relate to meditation as like you're supposed to grab thoughts and tell them to shut up. And as if it's a very active, almost aggressive process. The way to still all those thoughts or all of those desires or all of those preferences and opinions is just to be still. And that quietude and that stillness allows the waves to settle. And when they settle, then we can see what's going on underneath in the lake. You can see the bottom of the lake. So that's really a lot of what meditation is about. And it's very intimately related to this idea of freedom, which I want to talk about today. So we referred to, in the title of the talk, the illusion of freedom. So that's a little bit of the exploration that we're going to get into. Please have some tea. Unfortunately, I can't convey flavor notes to all of you out there in cyberspace, but one of the things you notice with aged liubao, which is a type of black tea, it's true black tea, is that it's very often aged in caves or in underground mines or in abandoned tunnels. And to me, this tea just tastes like a cave. It's got the mineral flavors that you would find if you were to drink like some very mineral-rich spring water. And so it relates in that way to the metal element, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And it's got the qualities, if you really sit and drink good old liubao, aged liubao, and you just sort of drop in, you allow the flavors and the aroma to take you somewhere. To me, it always just takes me down into a cave. I find myself just like, where am I right now? So it's a very special tea. I really love liubao. Like pu'er tea, it's a bit of an acquired taste. It's not similar to really most flavors that we have in the Western palate. It's something different. Similar to, there's the Mushroom Festival for all of you out there. The Mushroom Festival is going on in Telluride right now. The forest is full of mushrooms. There are mycologists from all over the world here right now. And similar to how a lot of mushrooms, especially if you wild forage them, have these flavors that you kind of can't even describe, I feel like. And either people like it or they're like, that's just too earthy for me, right? So I'm going to refer to some notes that I wrote down last night. I couldn't sleep, as per usual. And so I wrote down a couple notes to help keep my sharing today organized, lest we wander off into some God knows where. Let's see if I can hold this down somehow. Okay, so I opened up earlier with this quote from Kierkegaard, which is, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." And one of the primary projects for the existentialist philosophers, and some would argue that Kierkegaard was the first, was this idea of freedom. if you remove a transcendent principle, a god or some superstructure or some metaphysical meaning from life, then you're left with this sense of radical freedom. There's not necessarily a moral impetus. There's nothing saying you have to behave one way or another. And so I think for the existentialists, that created a tremendous sense of anxiety for the average person. And as a result of that anxiety, we try to order and organize our lives in a way that gives us a sense of, I can hold on to things. And that often manifests as groups, right? We have clubs and associations and tribal groups, and you might feel I'm a part of a nation, feel very patriotic, or I'm part of a city, or I'm part of a football club that I feel aligned with, or some form of identity to give you a sense of, now I can relax because I feel connected to something. And this is the root of inauthenticity, or living a disingenuous life. For a lot of the existentialists, they felt that when you begin to identify with these groups, to give that sense of freedom, to take the pressure valve, release some of the pressure valve, it's the beginning of inauthenticity. And so the project was how to live an authentic life in the face of this radical freedom and not freak out from anxiety or something. A lot of those existentialists went crazy on one level or another, and I believe that it's precisely because there was not a transcendent principle that was actually the thing anchoring them to reality. So we're going to talk about this, the responsibility of freedom, and are we actually free? Is that a real thing? And I want to tie that to the metal element. So for those of us who are studying tea in the context of Taoist medicine, we really follow the five seasons and the 5 elements as the organizing principle for inner work, for the types of teas that we drink in the season, for the types of brewing methods that we use. It's the 5 elements are the way that we follow nature. We say follow the earth. And metal is symbolically referred to as like the threshing tool that's used to separate wheat from the chaff. Or you can think of it in terms of knives. Knives are used for cutting things, for separating them, or for scaling a fish, or cutting away the fat. So when we talk about metal, we're talking about both cutting through delusion. There's a quality of objectivity about metal and cutting through illusion, but there's also a quality of separating that which is non-essential from that which is essential, right? And what the general symbolic significance of metal seasonally is the harvest, right? Gathering the harvest, taking what's essential so that you can have a winter where you have your basic needs met. Of course, we live in a time when you can have mangoes in the middle of December in New York City in a snowstorm, right? So we're not so connected to our absolute embeddedness in dependence on nature. As one Hopi person said to me, you can turn a faucet and the water turns on, or you turn a little switch and fire comes out. So we don't realize our total dependence on nature. We just think these things, where does water come from? Out of a tap, obviously. We don't really have a deep sense of not just responsibility and stewardship, but of dependency on the natural world. And therefore, we often feel disconnected from it, right? So this is where we're going to kind of start into this talk. So some of the qualities of the metal element, which we're going to come back to in the end, are as the leaves fall from the trees and things begin to change color, into yellows and browns and oranges, and there's this kind of moodiness to the autumn, which we'll see here soon. If you're going up the gondola or you go out into nature, you'll start to notice just the first hints of the yellows and the browns, that process of decay is starting. And it's a process of death, ultimately. But what we also don't see or maybe notice is that the seeds are being dropped, right? All of the fertilizer, which is all those dead leaves and things, are becoming a layer of soil on the forest floor that then is the essential nutrients that's going to bring life back in the spring. So we don't see all the life in that death, right? Or if you're out foraging for mushrooms during this week, if you take a log that looks like it's dead and decaying and decomposing and rotting, and you turn it over and you look more closely at it, what you see is that in that decay, it's providing life for millions of microorganisms. So this idea of death is actually an illusion of the mind. In death, there is extraordinary life, and they're two sides of a coin that's ever informing the other. So, okay, so how does all this relate to this idea of freedom? So the last thing I want to say about the metal element is that as the leaves fall from the trees, all of a sudden there's all this spaciousness. You begin to notice in the autumn there's sort of room to breathe. It relates to the metal or to the lungs. There's room to breathe. You can see more with all this spaciousness, and there's a certain quality of crispness in the air and a quietude, and also there's a feeling for a lot of people of kind of some grief as nature's letting go of things, as things start to descend and droop and fall. And a lot of people in our culture, through technology and social media and things, there's this emphasis on hyper-positivity. And everything should always look great. And everybody should always be happy. It's a form of pathological positivity. And this makes that contrast even more stark, that you're supposed to feel a certain way and everybody's presenting themselves a certain way, such that we don't really allow ourselves to access the grief of things ending, of all the fullness of summer beginning to descend. And the thing about that is that grief of things ending is one of the most profound teachers we have in nature and in the human collective experience. Because grief teaches us reverence. When you go to the funeral of somebody you love, what is the predominant sentiment? The preciousness of life, the impermanence of things. And without that sense of impermanence, or things ending, and a sense of how precious life is, we don't access the beauty of life. We wouldn't experience how beautiful and profound life is if everything went on forever, right? And so letting ourselves experience the grief that is the predominant emotion of the autumn is so utterly essential to the human experience, to appreciate beauty, to appreciate how precious this moment is, this life, this experience that we have. So these are all connected to the metal element. We talk about precious metals, rubies and gems and crystals and gold. These are things that grow mysteriously in underground caverns in the earth. They represent the shadowy underworld, the parts of ourselves that are unseen, the parts of the earth that we don't see, down in these caves where there's stalactites and crystals growing and things. And the process of grief, of letting yourself drop in, of dropping into the moment, is coming into contact with this preciousness. Another way of putting it is value. How do we evaluate value so much in modern life? In economic terms, it's money, which is represented by gold or silver or bronze or something, right? So, and we tend to be very attached to that type of value, right? That is based on rank or hierarchy or purchasing power. And as a result, we focus so much on that type of value, we've lost the intrinsic value of aliveness, of the value of being. And as a result, we tend to run around and spend all our times trying to find value in some form of external validation. And that is a losing game. And the further we explore that form of value, the further away we get from the intrinsic value of beingness. So I'm going to bring that in at the end as it relates to tea and the value that we can start to explore through a daily tea practice. Okay, let's pour a cup of tea here. Okay, so this idea of freedom is very much a concept, and it's a concept that's really interesting because sort of surreptitiously it shapes so much of modern life. And oftentimes we don't realize how much it's shaping our worldview or the motivations of what we're doing individually or collectively. There are a lot of different perspectives on freedom, and it's something that people will fight for viciously. If you do a Wikipedia search for wars of independence, the list just goes on for pages. So some people feel that they want freedom from government and corporations who seek to take away our freedoms. Right? And they spend a lot of their life energy on this topic, or they talk about it a lot. Or you have corporations who defend their freedom to extract raw material out of the earth and to sell it for maximum profit. It's an extractive and exploitative model, and they feel they should be free to do that. You have couples, like married couples, who will divorce each other because they want the freedom to see other people, or the freedom to indulge their impulses with other people, right? Because they're bored, or this thing or that thing. People feel that they should have the freedom to change their sex, right? This is a very topically relevant thing, while others believe that this goes against God's law. I'm not sure how they believe they should know that, but You have a lot of affluent people, or libertarians in terms of their philosophy, that believe they should be free to amass as much capital as they possibly can, while others believe that they should be free to live as long as they can. So you see this a lot in libertarian billionaires who are pushing forward a kind of transhumanist agenda based on singularity theorem or Neuralink, and we're going to put our consciousness into a chip somewhere, and we'll defy all the constraints that make us human. So age and gravity and things like this. And so that freedom is considered a a way if we can merge with technology, then we'll be free, right? You know, wars are fought around this idea, as I mentioned earlier, right? In the 1800s, we had the Civil War, which was freedom from an ideology around slavery. Or the American Revolutionary War, right, in the 1700s, which is about sovereignty of a people. So this concept of freedom is embedded in every aspect of life, every aspect of the human experience. Yet in reality, and this is really what I want to talk about, it's why this talk is called The Illusion of Freedom. It's very, very limited. And so what do I mean by that? If we reflect on all the ways in which we are not free, that list is equally long to all the ways that we are free, if not considerably longer, and more connected to natural laws. So are we free from gravity? You know, we're sitting here on the floor. We can't just get up and float out the door. We are not free to decide to stop breathing oxygen in exchange for carbon dioxide. You take it away for a very short amount of time, we'll see how free you feel. We're not free to escape from cycles of sleep and wakefulness. We have to do it, as do all organisms. We're not free to stop eating, you know, or defecating or something like this, right? Unless you're a breatharian, but I don't know if that's really a thing. I'd love to meet somebody who could show me how to do that. Wouldn't that be convenient? And at the most fundamental level, our bodies are made up of other organisms predominantly. There are over 100 trillion cells in the human body. Only 1 out of 10 of those cells is actually human DNA. You know, it's primarily bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms. We are a petri dish of other things, right? And if you want to zoom in a little more, you could say we're made up of molecules or atoms or monads. And so I don't know how or why, which makes no sense, that you're molecules and I'm molecules and in between the molecules, but somehow this grouping of molecules identifies as a colon, and you have your own ideas about what your molecules are called, and on and on. We're not even the molecules, the microorganisms, right? Trillions of them that aren't actually fundamentally you. And yet we also cannot escape from the experience of a subjective self. We're not free to say, nah, I decided I'm no longer going to identify as a self. I'm going to identify as something else, right? A lot of people try. And for a lot of folks, they say this is the aim of their spiritual work, is to transcend a sense of self-identity. But the irony of that is if liberation were to exist, there'd be no you to be liberated. So there's no you being liberated, right? We cannot free ourselves from symbiosis with other organisms. And all of the organisms that are meandering about this earth, flying in the sky or squiggling on the ground, or interacting with each other in the forest in one way or another, all of those organisms are utterly reliant on trillions of other organisms as well, that not only make up their bodies, but that they depend on for food and all sorts of other things. If we decided, you know, these trees, we're not into them, we wouldn't be around for very long, would we? And yet the great irony is that those corporations I was talking about earlier think, yeah, we can just cut most of them down. I think that's totally fine. It's obviously an insane proposal. Everything is utterly, utterly interdependent. And yet we experience ourselves as a separate thing. So this is where we get into this idea of freedom. What really is it about? You know, when people talk about merging with technology and how that's going to lift us from all these constraints that I was talking about, gravity and oxygen, sleeping and eating and things, feel into it a little bit. That does not feel like freedom. It feels like another level of entrapment, of a sort of enslavement, a technological bonding to what Daniel Pinchbeck, who's one of his essays is what inspired some of these ideas, what he calls a monoculture of mind, a hive mind. And this to me does not feel like a freedom from constraint. It feels like another level of, in some ways, a deeper entrapment, a deeper constraint. And yet we're rushing ahead as quickly as humanly possible with the AI agenda, right? That's not the nature of this talk and really what I want to talk about, but I do think it's very much related. That there's a seductive promise in this sort of transhumanist relationship to technology, a seductive promise of freedom. And the more and more I think you really tune into that does not look much like freedom to me. So, I talked a little earlier about the metal element and how a lot of the indigenous and earth-based traditions, if you talk to or you read from the perspective of an indigenous person who has been raised in a relationship to nature that does not see it as separate, our Western conception of freedom is, they can't even understand it. It doesn't make sense. It's only in a reality that's reductivistic, that the subject and object are very separate things, that the self is celebrated, valorized, that we somehow conceptually or philosophically separate the self from everything in nature, that this idea of freedom even makes sense. They can't even make sense of it, right? And yet, this idea of a separate self has become the foundation of our entire modern economy and way of life and culture. The basis in social media of how we use it is to celebrate the self, right? Most people are very busy taking selfies instead of showing the world that they perceive through their experience. And this hyper-celebration of the individual only creates a greater illusion around this idea of the freedom of the self, right? And so people chase after it, and they try to glorify it, and if they can join another club or buy some new thing or create a different type of identity or define themselves in one way or another, then they'll achieve some freedom at some point once they've gotten close enough to defining this self. But as we talked about earlier, the self is not made some separate thing from everything else. It's an utterly absurd idea. So, to bring this kind of full circle, this experience of decay and death that comes in the autumn that we can really tap into, it is a direct affront to the cultural norms. What do we see in our culture? An obsession with youth, an obsession with the springtime and the summer. What do we do with people as they get older? We tend to put them on drugs and then put them in a warehouse called a retirement home. Again, from an indigenous perspective, this is so utterly insane because a life well lived and nourished means that the elders are all of the wisdom keepers. They're the storytellers who can then pass on the wisdom of a culture to the younger generations so that it has some guide map, some roadmap for how to develop a life that allows for wisdom to develop and for people to have a sense of meaning and connectivity. When we decide to warehouse our elderly and to not support the natural development of wisdom in them, we are literally cutting ourselves off from the most important resource that human beings have, which is wisdom. Part of this comes out of a psychological distortion that is caused by post-industrial capitalism. This idea of progress and certainty and success and purpose, that we must always be growing and moving forward, infinite growth, an economy based on infinite growth. And so if an elderly person is no longer consuming much because their needs are all met, they're no longer kind of voraciously consuming, they're no longer valuable in an economy. In this post-industrial society, they're not serving a meaningful purpose, the purpose of consumption. And therefore, they're no good to us. Put them in a warehouse. That perspective or philosophy, pushed all the way out, would be at a certain age, you might as well euthanize them. They're not valuable because we are placing value on externalized, on economy, right? It's in service to a market. Everything, including our identity, if you observe the way that technology is used these days, everything, including our identity and our personality, is for sale. We promote ourselves endlessly through social media. There's a type of hyper-competitive, egoic system. And when you look at how most social media, specifically Instagram or Facebook, which are the predominant social media is available, most of it is based on artistic thievery and egoically driven, right? Myself included, we borrow memes, we repost other people's stuff. There's not a great deal of originality, maybe some, but most of it is borrowing things from other people to present something to reflect how we perceive ourselves and project it out into the world. And this language and logic of marketing replaces an authentic dialogue so that we can hide the intrinsic woundedness of the human experience. I don't mean woundedness like trauma. I mean woundedness in the essential recognition that our life is impermanent and that we are not free. And these, when we recognize these, they could either cause you to collapse into depression, or they could allow you to awaken into the recognition of the absolute, utter interdependence and interconnectedness of every living thing on planet Earth. And I would suggest things that are not living. That begs another question, which is, are those, quote, unliving things, is there consciousness there? I would like to suggest yes, but that's for another conversation. When we are in touch with the inescapability of the rise and fall of the human experience, this, what I call the woundedness of the human experience, there's a real freedom and liberation that can come from being honest about it. I don't know about everybody here, but for me, the most liberating experience are the moments that I'm really honest with how I'm really feeling, and that I admit to my limitations, my vulnerability, my fears, and where you show it. Isn't that the most liberating experience? With another person, to tell them, this is how I'm really feeling. I'm feeling vulnerable. As opposed to this upbeat, hyper-positive presentation that we are pathologically sort of showed through social media of how we're supposed to be. You should always be happy. You should always, your life should always look great. That is not fucking real. There's nothing real about that. But that is the life that we present to other people. And it is creating a profound collective pathology for human beings right now. Profound. Because this idea of vulnerability, expressing our fears and limitations, which is much closer to freedom, brings forth the qualities of humility and surrender to our limitations. When we begin to recognize our limitations, we feel a sense of humility, our smallness. And that is much closer to liberation and freedom than this false presentation of hyperpositivity. Everything's great. You know? When you ask somebody, how are you, right? The classic way that we say hi to people. How are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you? Good. Good. I'm glad everybody's good.
Good vibes only.
Yeah, good vibes only. All right? And it's not to say we should all be moping around and be depressed or something. But when somebody says to you, how are you doing? And you say good, does that really encapsulate the complexity of your inner experience ever? No. So this capacity for authentic dialogue, which is really where this liberation comes from. And the dialogue meaning the recognition of the interdependent experience we're having. It's not to say that every time I ask you, how are you doing, you need to give them a nuanced list of the complexity of your inner experience. But it is to say that the space for an authentic dialogue should be there. That is a much more liberated mode of interaction between human beings. Okay, so I want to kind of conclude with the last reflection. We'll have a sip of tea. When I know I'm talking too much, so I can't even get to drinking. Okay, so to kind of reiterate this point, our current conception of freedom, if you just think about how we conventionally think about it, is freedom to do what I want. You know, I want enough money so I can just do what I want. Or I want the freedom to go to live wherever I want. This is not real freedom. Because doing what I want is really synonymous with pursuing my impulses and my pleasure drives. Because that's actually what one is saying. I want to be free to just experience whatever I want to experience. Right? That's very much rooted in a self-oriented, a self-centric perspective. So our idea of freedom is to begin with already off. Right? And so the more we try to pursue that version of freedom, oftentimes the more we suffer. Aspen, Colorado has the highest concentration of billionaires who own property there in the world. It's also got the highest suicide rate in Colorado. Isn't that interesting? And part of it is people getting to multi-millions of dollars or billions of dollars and going, I have everything I could possibly ever want For 1,000 lifetimes, I could just do whatever I want. Or maybe not 1,000, but you know what I'm saying. And yet I'm still unhappy. And when people arrive at that place in their life, they go, what more? You know? And so, without a strong and deep sense of purpose, they often pursue pleasure to distract themselves from that gnawing feeling of I'm still not happy, I'm still not free. And when that pleasure runs out, okay, well, I'll divorce my wife. I need threesomes. No, that's not doing it. Sixsomes. Nope, that's not doing it. Okay, it's this, maybe this drug or this pursuit. I need to get into a submarine and go explore the Titanic. I'll get into one of the cock rockets and shoot off into space. That will definitely, then I'll experience freedom. Freedom of gravity. And yet this endless pursuit, where does it end? At what point does a person say, finally, satisfaction? And the reason that it is not providing satisfaction or a sense of freedom is that you're pursuing it in the wrong place, wrong question. That is not where freedom lies. Real freedom, and you find this in like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. You can find it all the way back in Beowulf and in all the great mythologies of the world. Real freedom comes with self-sacrifice. It comes with self-discipline. A balanced recognition that discipline and restraint can be expressions of love. And that a self independent of everything else and everybody else is just a fundamental illusion. As we've said, it's not real. So the pursuit of individual freedom is not one that ends in a sense of satisfaction, a sense of liberation. In fact, it ends in deeper levels of frustration, deeper levels of why can't I seem to get free? In the hero's journey, we always, in modern film, the hero's journey is the center point of so many films. When you go, oh, it's a hero's journey film, you kind of already know what's going to happen the rest of the movie, right? The one thing that is tend to leave out, the focus always tends to be about the hero saving the day. What often is not emphasized is how the hero must overcome all of their self-serving drives, sacrifice themselves, and take whatever gift they get from their great journey and bring it back for the well-being of the whole community. That it has nothing to do with them, right? So an example of this is like, in Gladiator, right? When Marcus Aurelius says to, I forget the gladiator's name, the gladiator says, I just want to go home to my family. I don't want this responsibility. And he says, that's precisely why you're the one. Because you're not hungry for the power. You're not hungry for the self-augmentation, right? When we recognize our embeddedness and our lack of subjective freedom, again, we experience this deep humility and surrender, the surrendering of our self-serving attachments. This is this process of opening up and sharing and serving. It's the source of true wealth, and not the wealth that's promised by material accumulation. It is the wealth that, or self-indulgence, or gratification of our impulses, or pleasure-seeking. It's also not freedom from these constraints that we talked about earlier. It's the freedom that's the awakening of our utter and meshed interdependence that defines all of coexistence for an organism. That's what actual freedom is. I'll end on a story, which is, there are a lot of kind of parables from the Buddhist Tipitaka, which is the three baskets of the Buddha's teachings. And one of them is a woman comes to the Buddha and is very upset, and she's crying, and she says, my son died. Can you please bring him back to life? I beg you. And she pleads with him and cries and falls at his feet. And he says, I will do this favor for you, but first you have to do one thing. You have to travel throughout this large village and find me somebody who has not lost a family member. And then I will do this favor for you. And she goes on this journey, and the journey transforms her because she can't find one person in the village who has a family member who hasn't died. And in the process, it opens her heart to compassion. It opens her heart to understanding that the suffering that all these people have experienced, the suffering of loss, of change, of death, is a universal experience of all people. And it not only opens compassion for her, but it opens up this insight, wisdom. And she comes back to the Buddha and says, I understand now. And so a tea practice allows us to put down a lot of this self-absorption. And what that means is that, there's a saying in Taoism which is a person of the world, a worldly person, puts something on every day, whereas a person of the Tao takes something off. Mm-hmm. When we sit down to a daily tea practice, and it could just be some leaves in a bowl, part of the meditation of the practice is to put down all of these concepts, all of the groups, all of the self-promotion, all of the sense of value that's based on external validation and recognition. Put it all down. And to drop into the intrinsic value of just being alive. It's not value in economic terms, based on relative comparison or rank in society. It's just the value of beingness. In a real tea practice and through meditation, we access silence, stillness, and spaciousness. These are qualities of the autumn and the winter, the yin time of the year. Stillness and silence are the doorways to freedom in its real sense. Freedom from concepts, including even the concept of freedom itself. Freedom from the concept of freedom. It is the putting down of these ideas in the practice. And how do we access it? Through being very present, through understanding the value of the moment just as it is, not without anything else. This practice of sitting in meditation and drinking tea every day is one of the most profound transformative tools to get in touch with the intrinsic value of just being alive. And that, I would suggest you'll have to go explore on your own, is real freedom.